Tonight's lecture, Learning Our Way Out of the Pandemic, features Assistant Professor of Law and Society, Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, who will speak about how Canadian schools fared during COVID-19, the sometimes unequal impacts on children, and ways educators can ensure a strong and more equitable start in 2021-2022. Throughout the pandemic, Kelly has been working with school boards to understand the impact of COVID-19 on learning in Ontario. She was the lead author on the COVID-19 Scientific Advisory Table Brief on Emerging Evidence on Impacts of Education Disruption in Ontario. Her past roles include Research Director at the Future Skills Centre and at People for Education, and Northern Director of Akitsiraq Law School in Nunavut. She also currently has 2 children who are in public school. Kelly is also the author of Pushing the Limits: How Schools Can Prepare Our Children Today for the Challenges of Tomorrow, which was a finalist for the Donner Prize for Best Public Policy Book in Canada in 2017. Please join me in welcoming Kelly Gallagher-Mackay.
It's really great to be here. I love my local library, and I'm honored to be invited to speak as part of this exciting collaboration between Wilfrid Laurier University and the Waterloo Public Library. I'm going to try and talk for not too long to allow lots of time for questions, because I think people do have a lot of questions. And I want to start, however, by acknowledging the lands we're on. Wilfrid Laurier University and the Waterloo Public Library are both situated on the Haldimand Tract, which is land that was promised to the Six Nations and includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. It's part of the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. And from one map to another, COVID-19, and I think you all know this, and I'm not going to spend most of this talk looking backwards, but COVID-19 has triggered what has been described by the UN Secretary General as a generational catastrophe in education. And the key driver of that are school closures combined with disruptions to education as we've ever known it. Some exciting possibilities about new ways of doing things, but a lot of kids away from school, away from their friends, and a lot of educators very stressed and exhausted, trying to constantly cope with changing rules, and sort of a mix between a very scary life context, very busy roles, because our educators very feminized workforce in Canada, and trying to meet the needs of their students, both for learning and for nurture and care. So what we've seen across Canada are extended system-wide closures, really for a period spanning about 15 months, starting in March 2020, and going through last year. And notably, Ontario had the longest school closures of anywhere in Canada, well above OECD averages. And some of those sort of provincial closures were exacerbated by local closures that were even longer, where there was a greater concentration of disease or local outbreaks. Throughout that time, students, even when they were in school, experienced disrupted education through a mix of remote and blended learning. My kids are in high school, and so we were seeing, even when they were in-person school, they were only there for half a day every second day. And we also saw profound changes within the life within the school. So cohorting, quadmesters, loss of extracurriculars and sports, tons of new routines and rules that were meant to keep kids apart, and no singing in the choir. It was nonstop. Unfortunately, most of the research suggests that these school interruptions or disruptions will have significant impacts on students, families, and societies. And again, I don't want to spend too long on this. This is a slide that was used by this science advisory table to sort of pull together some of the key results from our report. even the picture, the figure there is a little bit of a review of lost learning in a bunch of places, mostly in the UK and the US, right at the end of June 2020. So after only the first 3 months of the pandemic. And what that was showing was that students were on average losing months and months of achievement relative to earlier years. So if you looked at where students on average were expected to be based on 2019 and 2018, and in June or early September of 2020, they were pretty far behind. And we don't know so much about catch up. There's some pretty good evidence that when kids do get back into school, most kids are catching up, but not all of them. And the thing is, this has a really long-term impact for students. We looked at economic impacts. So we worked with an economist, and there's a long-standing tradition in economics called human capital. And what that suggests is the kind of losses that we're looking at of, half a year or a third of a year of schooling, which is a pretty low estimate, would potentially lead to very long-term drops in lifetime earnings for these students and big lost GDP for Canada unless we intervene. And I want to keep that key caveat at the front of your mind. A $1.6 trillion loss in our GDP is the kind of thing that usually you'd expect to get policy action. We've also heard a lot, and I know that's going to be the topic for the next night's presentation, so it's not going to be my primary focus, but we've also heard a lot about indirect health and social risks for students. Loneliness and social isolation were kind of built into the process of telling us all to stay home. A lot of kids struggled with the loss of structure. Our child protection system lost the ability to detect neglect or abuse, which raised real red flags. And all the hardships associated with the pandemic were inequitably distributed. So kids in low-income families were much more likely to have someone be sick in their family. Their parents were more likely to have lost their job or their housing to be, more risky. They're less likely to have had good internet. So what that means is that we saw historically disadvantaged groups doing much worse than overall average losses. In Canada, we don't have very much data. I don't know if you noticed, but that table that figure in the last was all international. And it is tricky because different jurisdictions cope differently with the how to adapt to the pandemic, especially last year. So not having Canadian data raises a bunch of big questions about not only grades or achievement as you'd measure it on tests, but also attendance, course completion, and other learning outcomes. There's a few things we can point to. So a recent small-scale study from Alberta showed early grade kids 6 to 8 months behind in literacy by midpoint of last year. A survey of 10,000 educators across Canada, in their professional judgment, many students are far behind and some won't be able to catch up without support. I was involved in a research project with the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, where we looked at data from the TDSB, which is sort of the most extensive and transparent educational data available in Canada. And we saw some stuff we weren't expecting in the TDSB. First of all, in the first 3 months, graduation rates went up. But if you think back to that period, and I know it's a long time ago now, that was also, there was a marks freeze in effect. And the school board changed a lot of how they did assessments. So we saw a lot more broken down smaller assignments rather than big tests and exams at the end of the year. Grades also went up, but gaps unfortunately increased. Even though for all students there was improvement, the improvements for some groups of students were bigger than others. The group who saw the biggest change were middle achieving students. So not the students at the very top, not, if you already had a 95, you might have a 95.2. Not the students at the very bottom. If you were already struggling to get your credits, you're probably struggling at least as much. But those middle students in the 60 to 75 range, they saw a lot of grade growth in that initial period. And unfortunately, though, that did not include groups like students with special education needs. We also looked in a different study at attendance across 5 GTAH boards. And what we found is something we're calling extreme attendance problems, or extreme absenteeism, went up a lot. About 6 times as many students were likely to miss more than half their classes as the year before in a similar period. So that's a big worry, because if we're losing track of our students, it's a big problem. And in fact, ironically, students in remote schooling, permanent remote schooling, were likelier to have lower chronic attendance problems, missing more than 10% of classes. And maybe that's because all they had to do was turn on their screen. Students in remote were much more likely to have big extreme attendance problems last year. So the big worry, the number one worry, is that COVID's education disruptions are going to exacerbate inequality. And unfortunately, studies from past crises and disruptions have shown that learning gaps may continue to grow, even if schools were to return to normal, as if we waved a wand. And there's also a real concern about cumulative effects. So if students have somewhat depressed confidence, maybe they're less likely to take as many courses, maybe they're less likely to go on to post-secondary. Those are the kinds of things that lead over time to worse life outcomes. How does that work? We had a kind of theoretical model around why COVID-19 has been making educational inequality worse. I've highlighted some of it already. So the burden of disease and disadvantage translates directly to more stress and hardship and less in-person school. We know there's existing research that says online learning works best for stronger students. So you've already got students who are struggling a bit, and then you put them in a form of learning that they're less likely to be responsive to, not helpful. There may be challenges with the home learning environment if you're in a small place. My daughter's math teacher used to teach math from his bedroom because his 2 kids were using the kitchen table, and his wife, who was another teacher, was teaching in the living room. Like, all of them were in the same spot, and that's middle class, but a lot more compressed than some houses. So space, supervision, if parents had to go out to work, even in the worst of the pandemic, and they needed to keep putting food on the table, kids were less likely to be supervised. And obviously, if kids are not at school all day, parental education and socioeconomic factors matter more. And the digital divide is real. It's huge for rural students who tend to be students who don't do as well in our system. It's even with school boards kind of committing to providing technology and internet, there continue to be some problems on that front. Sorry, I moved things around so I could see. So where are we at? There's a shadow crisis. COVID-19 has been described as a shadow crisis. All these inequalities aren't new, right? We already knew there were a lot of unequal outcomes in our system, even though I would argue strongly that we have one of the best public education systems in the world. We're still underserving some students, and we need to find ways to make it even better and more robustly equal. So here's some sort of general evidence going into the pandemic about what gaps look like. By and large, students sort of, if you use standardized measures, students from the bottom income quintile, the 20% of the bottom incomes, on average, graduating from high school, their standardized knowledge levels are about a year behind those from the top quintile. And in many Canadian jurisdictions, there is concern that students aren't graduating with the skills they need to go on to post-secondary. Again, we're better than many countries, but we've still got a ways to go. So there's the bad news. I'm actually not supposed to be talking about that. I'm supposed to be talking about now what, which is really what we care about. And I have been advocating through much of my research for an educational recovery strategy that goes far beyond just relying on the professionals in our schools to keep lifting superhuman burdens. One of the things that would be a key component of this strategy is to bring together all the experts in the room. Let's see educators, school boards, students, and parent representatives together to shape out what matters most in our strategy. How are we going to work on both social emotional learning and achievement and physical health and activity? The strategy should be driven by evidence. I'm a researcher. I'm a real believer that some things work better than others, and we should not be making things up, going just on feel. We need more money. If when you think about the huge economic costs of inaction, it's a good investment, and we should have improved data to see how we're doing. I am a bit of a nerd. So when I say more money, I just want you to recognize that we are spending far, 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 far less than our comparative countries. In the Netherlands, they're spending about $4,300 a student. I converted all these to Canadian dollars just so they were comparable. In the US, they're spending about $2,700 per pupil, specifically on learning recovery, not just school safety, which is where almost all the resources in the K-12 system that were sort of exceptional COVID resources have gone, but actually specifically on learning recovery, $2,700 per pupil. Britain, where they had a expert panel working on building a strategy, and their leader quit because he just couldn't believe how little money his government was giving him, $500 a pupil. Ontario, $70 a pupil. And that includes special education and well-being supports. The amount actually earmarked for learning recovery across Ontario for this coming school year that was budgeted last May, knowing that this crisis had been going on, works out to $11 a student. That is not enough to do anything except assume our classroom teachers are just going to do everything. What else should we think about with a strategy? So first of all, let's advocate for money comparable to other countries to help our kids catch up, to support our educators in supporting our kids. What else do we need to be sort of part of how we think about an education recovery strategy? And I don't know who the intended audience is, but these would be the sort of look-fors I'd be talking to teachers about if I was at a parent-teacher interview. So one of the things that teachers do best is look for kids' strengths, start where kids are. Don't just assume everything's normal. Don't treat September 2021 and all of this year as business as usual. It's time to figure out where kids are and start there. Probably it would be realistic to be slimming down curriculum, a little bit more prioritization on what are the key things we want to have people know. We need to see a balance. We have always needed to see a balance. COVID is not new in this respect, but it's made the issue come to the foreground between activities that are focused on social emotional learning and well-being with academic achievement. And we really need to see efforts to really reconnect kids to their school communities, to their friends and peers, meaningful relationships with the adults in the school, whole school projects. And again, the COVID rules make those really hard, but they matter. There's pretty strong evidence that says, school connectedness predicts a whole bunch of things like overall reported well-being, likelihood of dropping out, likelihood of using drugs. All of those things are kind of all tied in a bundle with people's sense of connection and relationship at school. So that needs to stay a priority. What we would worry about, and what policy prescriptions I'd be worried about, is dealing with any behindness that might have come out of the pandemic by streaming kids into permanent ability groups, because we know that ability grouping actually tends to worsen disadvantage. So kids are already struggling. Don't pull them behind. Don't repeat grades. Again, kids actually learn less the second time through a grade. It's one of the strongest findings in educational research. So it's really important that we keep kids with their peers, but that we care about the outcome enough to really backfill and provide support for learning. And I was listening to a psychologist on the radio, and she was being asked some questions that I didn't think she had expertise in. But I think her key message was also, don't panic and start drilling and skilling your kid at home. If they're a little behind, many kids will be in a position to catch up. You need to be providing supportive, relaxing, high expectations. You don't want to give up on caring about how they're doing at school, but you don't want to be freaking out that this short-term disruption is permanent and scarring, and not too much drill and skill at home either. At a system level, I think we also have to kind of think very carefully about the risks associated with remote learning. I already talked about how it works less well for kids who are not doing as well. And I want to remind you, you may or may not have read a lot of dated press releases from the Ministry of Education, but when we put in optional remote learning as a policy choice in our education system to deal with COVID, that is something that only happened in 2 Canadian jurisdictions, Ontario and Alberta. When it was introduced, it was meant to be a short-term measure only when public health circumstances required adapted delivery. I would argue we're past that point right now, and it's a little problematic to keep giving parents an exit valve. First of all, some of the parents who are most anxious about safety might opt to take their kids out of the school system instead of fighting for better conditions within our schools. Ontario data, which has been produced by both a sociologist at OISE and great journalism from the Globe and Mail, suggests full-time remote schooling has been disproportionately chosen by racialized and lower income families, which is a bit of a worry. Those are probably the families who already maybe were more likely to have problematic relationships at school. And unfortunately, the data that we do have on the impact of remote schooling versus in-person, again, fewer gains. So we've got this giant social experiment going on to put kids in full-time remote schooling. For now, if someone went out in March and is still in full-time remote schooling, we're looking at, coming up on 2 years of their lives, and we still don't know what the effects on children are. If you were designing it as a researcher, you wouldn't be allowed to do this. But obviously that creates some real challenges for the school system, as long as the policy framework says it's a choice to rebuild trust in the safety and benefits of common schooling. We want our kids back together again. And there's a real concern about the de facto segregation that's coming from it. So I wanted to highlight 2 tensions that you hear a lot when we talk about, well, what are we supposed to be doing now? One is just the basics, right? Should we just get back to basics? I talked about slimmed down curriculum and having priorities. Well, no. or certainly we want a kind of new basics. There's a great big group in the States that study educational equity and are trying to find how do we assess how we're doing with educational equity. One of their key recommendations is access to enhanced curriculum is a core measure of educational equity. So even though kids are struggling, we still need to make sure they're getting those rich three-dimensional experiences. And unfortunately, back to the basics, thinking frequently sort of rebounds to the disadvantage of kids where there's already low expectations in place. And we know that expectations are one of the most powerful predictors of how well kids do overall. Priorities we want. You know, we're going to care more about making sure kids get hands-on science lab experience. That every kid should be doing a lab where they get to sort of test cause and effect. Yeah, that maybe we're really going to focus on the science of climate this year. That in history, we're really going to look at sort of the rise of popular movements in secondary school. We're really going to understand our Indigenous history in the early years. So just the basics, be worried. Next, remedial learning. Are we going to just remediate? Remediate tends to mean go and finish catching up before you move on to the next thing. And my image for this is a peloton. I don't know if anyone's ever watched racing, but there's this cool thing where people get a turn in the backdraft and that helps them catch up and use less energy to catch up. What's been working really well in the US, where they're starting to measure it, is something called learning acceleration as opposed to remediation. And that's where teachers working with tutors who are following along in the curriculum provide sort of just-in-time scaffolding so that they're able to help students be able to learn what's happening in class rather than go back and redo everything. So strategic reintroduction of key concepts, reinforcement, that is very hard for just a classroom teacher working by her or himself to pull off. And that's where we start needing extra resources. I would also argue that we're hearing a lot about why we shouldn't be worrying about achievement. The real focus right now is well-being. And obviously well-being is critically important. I would never want to underrate it. But we also need to care about how much kids are learning. Academic achievement is not just about what our test scores are. It's a key part of students' long-term well-being. Academic achievement does make a difference to what we can know and can do when we become adults entering the workforce. And when we think about how fast changing the future skilled workforce is, it requires post-secondary graduation. We need to care that our kids are learning enough to be successful with whatever comes next. And we can't put that on hold for years. And really, we're in COVID year 3 right now. And childhood is short, as every parent knows, not the nights, but the years. There's also a lot of importance around building stronger, reinforcing strong connections between home and school. If there's one thing you've heard a lot from everyone, but boy, parent council meetings are easier online. And even parent-teacher interviews are easier online. Some of these tools mean that we understand, parents and teachers understand each other's situations much better, and that's a real win. We should also be thinking about how we can resource schools so that they have stronger connections to their communities. And I love a program that's happening in Quebec. They have school community learning centers in their English schools, 0.5 time positions funded to create partnerships and bring resources into schools. They apply for grants, 6-to-1 return on investment. Let's try and actually put people in schools whose job it is to help build better connections to the community, not least our local libraries, and stronger relationships with mental health agencies. I think I've been talking about it again and again. Our teachers have done amazingly resilient work to try and cope with everything the pandemic has thrown at them, but we can't leave full responsibility on them to just keep adapting and meet growing gaps. I've been doing a lot of research on high dosage tutoring, which is 2 to 3 times a week, embedded into the school day. It is among the most effective educational interventions, looking at everything, more effective than early childhood education for helping students gain skills. And they can even be gaining like 2.5 years of learning in one, where they're getting these kinds of really targeted supports tied to the curriculum. But in our system right now, tutoring is going way up, but only on the for-profit side, so supporting kids who tend to have more resources already. Community tutoring is doing amazing work, but it's a very disconnected ecosystem and under-resourced. There isn't one single government agency that's responsible for paying for community-based tutoring, and they've got a lot on their plates. I'm not going to nerd out on why we need better data infrastructure, but it would really help to know how we're doing. When I was writing the science brief with my colleagues, we had a really hard time making the case for educational harm because there was no data coming out of our education system on how our kids were doing. And you compared that to the sort of day-by-day health data, and it was easy for us to not be a priority. So we need data because we want to be able to understand and balance risks and benefits of reopening strategies. We want to understand if what we're doing is working, and we want to keep track of risks of systemic discrimination. So my bottom line is, if we're going to learn our way out of the pandemic, we need to ask our governments to dedicate resources and build collaboration to ensure this crisis doesn't make things worse. And we shouldn't just be aiming for a return to normal, because normal was already pretty unequal and not quite good enough. So we need to use the power of our great public education system and more to treat educational recovery as much of a priority as economic recovery and health prevention. So this is a list of my collaborators, and I can be reached at Twitter on @galmac. That's, you know, a little @ KGalmac, KGALMAC. I hope that there are some questions. I hope that just wasn't on and on and on.
So if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the question answer box, and then I will be able to share those with Kelly. But Kelly, would you be able to touch a little bit more on the tutoring slide? Just you had a couple back. There was the 2 different types of tutoring. Could you talk about the one that you were saying was very beneficial?
Well, sure. I would love to talk about tutoring. So generally, there's high and low dose tutoring. So if you're seeing somebody for 1 hour a week, that's low dose, and it helps a lot. But if you're getting to see someone 2 to 3 days a week, there's a ton of evidence that says it helps students really work to not only catch up, but get beyond where they need to be. And it's exciting because it works at different ages. So most of the research is actually about early readers. And we do know that some of the most disruption for pandemic was among younger kids. So good. But there's also incredibly promising work with a group called Saga Tutoring with high school students looking at things like math. So for all ages, tutoring can be a really effective intervention. And that, you know, it was that Saga Tutoring, that math program, which was seeing, you know, 2.5 to 1 kind of gains over the period of a year. And, you know, I think it's really worth looking at whether we could think about something like a youth tutoring corps, a big service learning program where students, postgraduate students, like university grads, college grads, had a chance to work in schools for a stretch for a year to get really trained, to give back to the community, to learn about our schools. It would certainly be great for recruitment to our ed schools. And teaching is a job of the future.
Okay, so no questions have come in yet. Oh, there we go. Actually, we have one. Are you ready?
Oh.
Excellent. Can you comment on the idea that learning gaps are both a social construct as well as something pushed by the standardized testing and educational intervention industries? Many students also gained a lot during the pandemic. Did you explore those gains?
Yeah. So I don't think it's true that it's purely a construction. So let's be clear that students absolutely learn at home. We learn all kinds of things. And Mark Twain's classic comment, never let your schooling get in the way of your education, is as true as ever. Our kids got to be much better cooks, but did great work on their routines. But there are things that we learn at school that we don't learn at home. And if we had shut down our hospitals for 26 weeks, we wouldn't be talking about how great it was that everyone had alternative healing. So I think that we know how to measure learning in math and reading and science and history. There is real evidence that those outcomes were depressed relative to normal years. And because I spent some time working with the Future Skills Center, where we were looking at adults in the workforce, all the people who were having the biggest problems on the job front were people whose literacy level was in the bottom, the 5 literacy levels, more or less. People who didn't have strong literacy and numeracy skills are the ones who are being left behind by the future economy. And you can totally get too obsessed. It is not the only thing that schools should care about, but not caring about whether students are learning and those academic subjects, specifically geography, history, science, English, and math, that's not fair to students either. And what's particularly worrying is that, middle-class parents are likely going to make sure their kids keep going and keep having academic high aspirations. Standardized tests can be problematic. I mean, there's terrific people like Ibram Kendi has really done a really great critique around over-testing and overachieving. Sorry, I don't know if you can see my daughter sneaking away to say I'm starting dinner. It's problematic for sure, our standardized test industry, but it's also not fake. It's not fake news. And it is one of the best predictors of whether people are going to vote, whether people are going to be healthy. Can people read and understand prescriptions? Can we make sense of information about the risks of vaccination? All of those things, schools do that for kids, and we should care if they don't. And I study educational inequality. And one of the things about studying systemic discrimination is you actually need benchmarks. You need to look at sort of comparable outcomes. And boy, if you can say, you're putting students into a program where 40% of them aren't getting their credit or aren't passing their EQAO test, that's the evidence base we used to attack streaming. We cared about it. It really helped to have everyone write the same test. It shouldn't be the focus of our whole school system. It was terrible having our whole school system's goals be 75%, 80% of students getting level 3. That's not a good enough set of goals for school systems. Our kids need much more, but we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Excellent. Okay, we have another question. Would your recommendation that interventions, community tutoring, be targeted to schools in identified lower income neighborhoods, or should it be across the board?
I think it should be currently, the existing $10 million we're putting into, we're doing two things in Ontario right now about tutoring. There's about $10 million through the Learning Opportunities Grant, which does go to lower income schools. But again, I want you to think about how little money that is. If you imagine how much is going into private tutoring for kids who are in the have box. So there is about 10 million going to low income schools. There's also a not yet understood, because I cannot find the number, some amount of money going to Mathify, which is a big, great program run by TVO, where you can get one-on-one math tutoring for your kid for free, no matter who you are in the city or in the province, if they're a student in a public school in Ontario. So I'm willing to bet we're spending a heck of a lot more across the board on that freely accessible one, and I don't think it's available to the same people. So we know there are vulnerable kids in every school in Ontario. So I think it does make sense to target for need. It makes sense to have some particular focus. Like if I was putting those community acceleration people in, I would put those in low income schools differentially, but tutoring support probably needs to be around where there's groups of kids that have more need. And so maybe in some schools there's only one or two small groups, and so you'd have a tutor in for half a day, a couple days a week. And in other groups there might be more, in other schools there might be more. I think it should probably be tied to academic need in terms of targeting. Anonymous attendee, how could youth serving community organizations or community programs best support within this recovery? Great question. And I'm guessing you come from a youth serving community organization, so I'm guessing you probably know more about it than me. What I would say is we have seen some youth serving organizations really stepping up with innovative new approaches like online tutoring during the pandemic. But a lot of the community organizations are really focused around like the social emotional, the play, the physical activity alongside the academic achievement. And I think that's a real strength of those organizations. It's certainly what makes kids want to go to after school programs. So our kids are probably going to need support on many fronts, and I would expect that youth serving organizations know their own communities best. And I'm wishing luck and wishing for those nice close relationships with schools. And I know how hard those are to achieve. Sometimes Fortress School, it can be really hard to build those relationships. It takes energy. When that's working, it's an incredible enrichment for students. How do we see?
How do you see libraries supporting this initiative?
Well, I mean, learning for joy, right? Reading for joy. It's really good when we're trying to build those connections, build those relationships, rediscover the joy in learning when kids have been online all the way. Although I do love my library app. I'm like, oh my God, it's so great. But being a space of community for students, the one-to-one relationship for those students who are keeners, boy, that having your local librarian to help you guide, that's a huge plus. And I think, creative, interesting, engaging books. Our libraries do a fantastic job with a more diverse, helping diversify the texts that are being used in our schools, even though our schools are getting a lot better. The ability to sort of meet students where they are is something I think libraries really specialize in, and both community libraries and school libraries, which I hope we don't just let go because we're so excited about computers and technology. It's an important space in the school.
So we have two other questions. One is a bit long, so I will go to the first one and then we'll go to the second one. What kinds of support are comparator countries putting into student well-being versus academic achievement remedial supports? What do you think schools and communities need to get doing to support the well-being metrics that are foundational to academic achievement?
Great question. And there's actually a lot of discretion in the funding envelopes that say you see in the US and in the UK, which are the two I know the most about. So for example, in the UK, they have a youth mentorship program as well as an ambitious billion-dollar tutoring program, which is focused on sort of school activities that promote social emotional learning and engagement, community engagement, and some of those real winners. And I think that's really excellent. In the US, because it's a great big federal investment in K-12, and they're like us, states are in charge of education. Here, provinces are. There's a huge amount of discretion, and there's actually really interesting differences between states as to how they're balancing. But for sure, play-based groups, fabulous. We know we need that. I don't think there's anywhere that's doing all academic, and I've never proposed all academic. And really, the first thing I said that we need for our strategy is we need everybody at the table about what kind of balance we should strike. I don't want to see academics go off the table. I don't think that's good for kids. I don't think that's good for equity. But we need our teachers' unions and our school board reps sitting down with our government and our parent reps to figure it out. I can't prescribe the right mix for us. And I like the question from, I'm assuming I had a teacher called Mr. Clausen from A. Clausen. Just see that name and I think, oh, it's Mr. Clausen, but it probably isn't. It's tough. I mean, I think the thing about a straightforward conversation, and that really does come down to planning time within your school, is you need to have support for saying this is going to be the priority and not that, so that it's not you as an individual teacher feeling like you aren't getting done what you're expected to get done, right? It's finding an informed community within your own group. And I think it's teacher organizations who are likeliest to be the ones who can lead those real conversations about prioritization. I can't do it. But I think that teacher survey is really important, because what I took out of it, where they talked to the 10,000 teachers across Canada, is that people felt like some of what was being missed had hit a point that was problematic. And that for some kids, and again, it's not everyone, some kids are doing just fine. But for some kids, if we don't intervene, there's some real risks. Erin, you got a lot of questions. I'll go back because I was trying not to be too nerdy. This is what, not me, but UNESCO, the United Nations Environmental, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, recommends in terms of data collection. So rapid data collection formats. So if you're already using a diagnostic reading assessment in your classroom and you've been using it for years, wouldn't it be fantastic if, board wide, people were all using the same tool and you were just it was the tool you were using to help put kids into the right groups and get them the right materials already, but you were just also submitting it somewhere so it could be aggregated up, so we knew how kids were doing relative to where we'd expect them to be. That was a lot of the data collection in the US, was using these assessments like STAR that are actually already allow the system to aggregate up the data. So not the full, not necessarily the full formal EQAO thing. I think there's a real reason we didn't do census-based testing, but wouldn't it have been nice to do some sample-based testing? I really think it's important that we do collect it with some demographics so that we can monitor the equity impacts. It's now required under the Anti-Racism Act. And it should be low stakes. And it should be used to benchmark. I had a very disturbing conversation with the Deputy Minister of Education, who was saying, well, we don't have any data saying that the students are behind in Ontario, so how do we know they are? And to me, that was a justification for not spending money. I think we do need data to point out just how serious this is for Canadian students generally and Ontario students specifically, because we did actually have the most extreme education disruption in Canada.
Excellent. You did it. You got through all the questions.
Cool. I'm really glad there were questions. I would have thought I'd bored you all to tears.
No, that was great. Thank you so much, Kelly, for being here with us tonight. And Dawn, I'll invite you to join us if you'd like. Just maybe if we could repeat when the next program is, that would be perfect.
And of course, I have everything closed at this point. November 24th, if I'm remembering correctly, at 7 p.m. is our next event. Dr. Ava Speak will be speaking to international education. So we look forward to seeing everyone then. If you could register on the Waterloo Library's website, that would be fantastic. And thank you so much, Kelly, for everything. That was really wonderful.
Well, thank you very much, both the Laurier Faculty of Education and the Waterloo Library for the chance to be part of this great event. And thank you to all of you who came out on Thursday night and participated in this session, and especially those of you with questions to make me feel like I wasn't talking into a void. It's very weird when you can't see people.
It is. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great night. And we hope to see you at the library soon.